The jungle does not welcome strangers. It breathes, it watches, and when it hungers, it takes. Long before cartographers charted its edges, before helicopters rattled its canopy, the jungle of thorns had another name, a name lost in the tongues of time, whispered now only by winds and bones. They called it Arizal, the burning cradle. Here, in the deep folds of an unbroken green world, somewhere between the high ridges of pre-Andean South America and the dark veins of the Amazon, rose a civilization unknown to the empires of men. While Rome built roads and China raised walls, a different kind of kingdom bloomed beneath thorn-wrapped trees and rivers of fireflies. This was the realm of the flame bearers, a people who did not conquer land with swords, but with fire, spirit, and silence. Their origin is veiled in myth, but oral traditions still echo in the tongues of certain tribes, far-flung and scattered. According to one such account, told only to initiates in smoke-filled ritual huts, the flame bearers were not born, but forged, during an age when the skies bled and stars fell into the jungle. From the heart of a burning tree, the first of them emerged, skin of ember, eyes of night, carrying the sacred flame that would never die. They did not build cities in the open. Their homes were carved into cliff faces, hidden in mists, woven into thorns. They were masters of camouflage, architects of smoke, and guardians of flame, not fire for war, but fire for memory. They believed that flame was the breath of the ancestors, and that to forget the fire was to lose one's name. Every child, upon birth, was marked with a coal symbol, a sigil unique to their bloodline, passed from generation to generation. What little evidence remains, fragments of carved obsidian, hardened pitch rings used in rituals, scorched cave markings, has baffled modern archaeologists. Officially, the flame bearers do not exist. But unofficially, expedition teams have vanished, their last transmissions filled with references to burning symbols on trees, chanting in languages no one could identify, and eyes in the jungle watching through the smoke. One expedition in 1937, led by a rogue French ethnographer named Marcel Duclos, disappeared near the Rio Irapi Basin. His last journal entry reads, "They do not want to be seen. We found the black path today, thorn walls rising on both sides. There was singing, soft, like ash falling on drums. Something followed us in the mist. It left a circle of coal outside our tents. I believe it was a warning or a welcome." Duclos' body was never found, but his journal, half-burned and soaked, was discovered by a jungle trader years later, sealed in a waxed pouch under a pile of roots. The handwriting, scorched but legible, referenced something called the Temple of the Living Fire, a place said to hold the eternal flame carried by the first of the flame bearers. But what was this temple? And who were these people really? Shamanic mystics, jungle scientists, or a forgotten branch of early man, isolated and evolved alongside the flame? The thorns guard their secrets well, but the jungle remembers everything. And in its breath, the flame still dances. It begins with legends older than memory. In the oral traditions passed through smoke and breath, a name emerges again and again, Iskara. Iskara was not a king, not a prophet, but something older, the first flame bearer, born in a time when the sky wept ash and the rivers boiled at their edges. According to jungle lore, she was shaped from firewood struck by lightning on the night of Red Rain. The fire that engulfed the forest that night did not consume it. It transformed it. When the flames finally subsided, tribes who ventured near the burnt zone found strange symbols etched into the blackened bark of surviving trees, spiraling outward in patterns no one could decipher. In the center of it all stood a woman, alive but not breathing, cloaked in soot and ember. She held a single coal in her hand, still burning, never fading. That coal, they say, was the seed of Arizal. Iskara wandered alone for years, speaking only in chants. Birds fell silent when she passed. Trees leaned away. Her footsteps left scorch marks on the leaves, but her body remained untouched. Those who followed her either disappeared or returned bearing glowing tattoos on their skin and stories they could not fully remember. Eventually, a small band of seekers, outcast hunters, dying midwives, a deaf child, began to form around her. These were the first chosen. Iskara never taught them how to speak, only how to listen, to flame, to smoke, to silence. They followed her deep into the thorniest part of the jungle, where no tribe dared tread, a green abyss of vines, horned roots, and carnivorous mist. It was there, under a cliff that bled red sap, that she halted. They dug with hands and sticks. They bled. They wept. And after 7 days, they uncovered a pit filled with petrified charcoal, ancient beyond reckoning. Iskara descended first, vanishing into the darkness. When she returned, her body was marked with coal lines from neck to ankle, and her eyes burned a dull orange in the night. She carried with her a bundle of glowing resin, wrapped in leaves. With a wordless motion, she kindled it. This was the first ceremony of flame. Each member of the chosen was called forward, one by one, and marked on the chest with a burning twig dipped in the sacred resin. The scars it left behind never faded. These were not wounds, but symbols, ancestral blueprints meant to be passed down. From this core group would rise the first clans. Ashwalkers, silent trackers who could walk through smoke unseen. Flint binders, artisans who carved obsidian into talismans. Ember tongues, storytellers who sang in firelight. Coal mothers, women entrusted with keeping the sacred fire alive during childbirth. These clans formed the Heart Circle, the innermost order of Arizal. Around them, others gathered. Wandering tribes heard the strange songs coming from the jungle and followed. Some returned with eyes glazed over. Others never returned at all. But those who stayed were transformed. Not just spiritually, but physically. Their skin grew darker, their lungs stronger. They could walk barefoot on scorched earth without pain. They developed rituals that bent the line between dance and firecraft, between breath and smoke. Fire became language. Silence became law. Iskara herself was eventually lost, or perhaps she ascended. Some say she walked into the temple of the living fire and never emerged. Others say she became the fire, her soul residing in the eternal coal that still burns at the temple's core. But the flame-bearers do not weep for her. They say she watches, in every flickering flame, in every curl of jungle smoke. And when the fire calls again, she will return. Until then, her children guard the jungle. Until then, the flame is never to be extinguished. Generations passed beneath the green vault of the jungle. The flame-bearers flourished not in conquest, but in concealment, living beneath the skin of the land like fire and coals, quiet but unquenchable. Their world had no walls, only boundaries of silence and sacred flame. And at the center of that world stood the unwritten law: do not be seen. Do not forget the fire. Their cities, if they could be called that, were built into the bones of the jungle. Caverns hollowed into cliffs, woven huts suspended from colossal branches, bridges made not from ropes but living vines, trained for generations to twist and grow into pathways. Every structure was hidden under layers of moss, bark, and shadow. From above, nothing betrayed their presence. From the ground, even less. To the flame-bearers, visibility was vulnerability. They believed the jungle was a living entity, not a god, but a being of memory and will. It watched those who moved within it. It whispered warnings and buried the arrogant. And so the flame-bearers became invisible to time. Their society was structured in circles, not hierarchies. At the core was the Heart Circle, descendants of Iskara's original chosen. Each family bore a flame sigil, passed by branding or ink of burned sap, which could only be transferred during moonless nights. These sigils weren't merely symbols. They were maps of memory, detailing each bloodline's origin, service, and sacred duty. Beyond the Heart Circle were the outer circles: fire hunters, shadow scouts, resin crafters, smoke callers. Roles were fluid, determined not by birth but by one's communion with the flame. Children were tested at 7 summers, placed in a smoke dome, alone, with only a flickering coal. If they emerged calm and silent, the flame had accepted them. If they coughed, cried, or tried to escape, they were marked as ash returned and never allowed near sacred fire again. And yet, even those exiled from the flame were not discarded. They were sent to serve the jungle itself, tending its edges, feeding the thorn walls, ensuring outsiders never crossed too far. The flame bearers did not write history. They burned it. Rituals were carved into living memory through fire dances, chants in smoke, and symbols drawn in soot on skin. A story wasn't told. It was performed, surrounded by rings of controlled fire, with dancers embodying ancestors, spirits, and the jungle itself. These performances were never repeated, each one consumed in the act, becoming part of the jungle's breath. But not all was ritual. The flame bearers were practical mystics. They harvested sap from the blood trees, crimson-leaved giants whose resin could burn underwater. They created torches that smoldered without light, sending heat signatures that could be read by trained eyes. They devised smoke signals far more complex than any known code, swirling columns that told entire histories in shape and flow. No outsiders had ever seen them and lived to speak of it, or so it was believed, until, in the late 17th century, a Spanish missionary named Padre Leon Serrano vanished during an expedition through the jungle between the Yupes and Apaporis rivers. Months later, a lone canoe drifted into a Jesuit outpost, carrying only a bundle wrapped in fire-hardened leaves. Inside was a black stone tablet, etched in soot, depicting a woman with a burning heart standing atop a circle of thorns. Along the edges, markings resembling both Latin and a language never before seen. The priests declared it heresy and destroyed the tablet. But one friar secretly sketched its contents into his journal. That sketch survives to this day, held in the archives of a forgotten monastery in northern Spain. It is labeled simply, Mulier de Flama, the Woman of Flame. Historians dismissed it as apocrypha, but to the jungle, it was a message: we are watching. We remember. And still, no one came closer. The thorns had begun to grow. At the center of the flame-bearer's world stood the temple of the living fire. Not a palace, nor shrine, but something older and stranger, carved into the base of a mountain no map has ever named. The jungle calls it Kurtau, the mountain that breathes, a massive black ridge veined with red stone and always shrouded in mist. Even from afar, birds avoided its slopes. From within, light flickered where none should exist. The temple was not built, it was uncovered. According to flame legend, Iskara did not create the temple, she awakened it. As the story goes, in the 7th year after her flame was born, Iskara led her people to the base of Kurtau. There, she laid the first coal into the mouth of a cracked obsidian wall, and fire erupted in a perfect circle, splitting the cliff open to reveal a hollow chamber, lined not with stone, but something smooth, dark, and warm, as if the mountain had once been alive and still remembered breath. Inside, the walls were etched with thousands of tiny spirals, flame glyphs, so ancient even the heart circle could not read them. They pulsed with dim red light, as if they absorbed heat from the torches. At the very center stood the pyracole, the eternal flame. This fire was unlike any other. It burned without wood, without smoke, and without ever dimming. Scholars today debate the possibility of geothermal gas vents, but those who've seen it and lived describe it as suspended, like a ball of slow lightning trapped in breath. Its presence was not merely warmth, but memory, standing near it. One could feel forgotten names return, childhood sorrows reignite, and ancestral voices echo in their bones. The temple was not a place of prayer. It was a vault of transformation. Every generation, one child from each clan was chosen to undergo the trial of flame, a ritual so secret, even its name was forbidden outside the temple walls. What is known comes from fragments of smoke song passed down through hidden chants. They enter whole. They return scarred. One eye burns the past. One hand carries the coal. The jungle knows them. The fire marks them. No lie survives the trial. Those who returned became the coal bearers, masked figures who served as judges, historians, and executioners. They wore cloaks made of soot-dyed feathers and spoke only in flame tongue, a whistled dialect taught only to those who had survived the trial. One breath, one flame, one truth. This was their law. The pyrocool was also used in the flame remembering, a ritual performed when elders neared death. Unlike most human cultures, the flame bearers did not mourn with silence. They mourned with burning. The body was not cremated. It was placed within the outer circle of the temple during moonless nights, and the eternal flame would extend itself without touch. The body would vanish into light, leaving behind only a fine, black dust that was gathered in small, coiled stone urns. These urns were not buried. They were returned to the jungle, hidden in thorn knots, placed in the hollow of fire trees, or released into the river wrapped in red bark. Thus, the ancestors returned to the land, to whisper in leaves, to flicker in torchlight. The jungle was their true grave. But the temple also carried a warning. Above the eternal flame, carved in soot-dark glyphs, was a phrase spoken only in sacred ceremony. When the fire screams, close the gates. No outsider knows what it means. But some elders speak of a forgotten era, when the flame once screamed and the gates were not closed. And that was the night the jungle wept black rain. They never explained further. They only say, never wake the fire twice. Though hidden by thorn and time, the flame bearers did not live in isolation. The jungle was a breathing map, crisscrossed by rivers, root paths, and wind channels. And like all maps, it had intersections. Slowly and inevitably, other tribes found their way to the edges of Arizal. The first encounters were not meetings. They were warnings. It began with ash. Not fire, ash. Tribes drifting too close to the forbidden jungle would wake to find small piles of white ash at the edge of their campfires, sometimes shaped into spirals, sometimes left in silence. Animals would avoid the spot. Children would fall sick. Elders would dream of eyes in the trees. These were not threats. These were the flame bearers' way of saying, we see you. For generations, surrounding tribes respected the boundary. Some feared it. Others revered it. Among the Takano and the Matapi, stories spread of fire walkers, spirits who protected the forest heart with burning breath. Among the Yanomami, women sang of a mist bride who danced with flame and vanished into the leaves. Among the Makina, the word Kuroki, the unseeable ones, became synonymous with jungle gods. But not all believed. Eventually, curiosity crept in, not through warriors, but through wanderers, hunters, dream seekers, shamans in search of deeper visions. One such man was Teavin, a root hunter of the Banawa. He claimed the forest called to him in dreams, red trees, black rivers, and a woman with burning hands. Against the advice of his elders, he entered the jungle beyond the thorn line. He returned after 9 days, naked, silent, with glowing coal marks circling his chest. He never spoke again, not a word, but from that day, his presence calmed storms. His touch healed fevers. His tribe began calling him the fire-scarred one. Some believed he had been blessed. Others cursed. Teavin died 10 years later. On the day of his death, the jungle near his village erupted in flame. No smoke, no heat, just sudden light. And then it vanished. Nothing was burned. These quiet contacts grew in frequency. Over decades, certain tribes began leaving offerings, bundles of red bark, obsidian shards, or flame-colored feathers, at the jungle's edge. In return, they received gifts never explained, medicines that cured poison, sap that healed wounds, and once, an entire child returned from drowning, marked with a coalglyph of protection. The flame bearers had begun a system, an unspoken diplomacy. No words, no meetings, just exchanged through flame and silence. But every gift carried a weight. In time, one tribe, the Eritani, became bold. A young leader, Hikoja, decided to bring fire back to the flame bearers. His people had suffered drought, and he believed the flame bearers owed them aid. He and 7 warriors crossed the Thorn line carrying torches. They were never seen again. 2 weeks later, a stone canoe drifted downriver, carrying only their torches, burned to white, and a coil of thorn vines tied in the shape of a warning spiral. From that day forward, the jungle near the Eritani village grew darker. The birds vanished. The fruit trees dried. By season's end, the village had relocated entirely. The message was clear: fire may be shared, but never demanded it. These early encounters were the beginning of something delicate, a dance between fear and reverence, between myth and diplomacy. But the balance was fragile, because even as some tribes learned to leave the jungle untouched, others began to speak of entering it, not to worship, but to claim. And the flame bearers were watching. The flame bearers believed the jungle spoke in signs, not with voices, but with the shifting of leaves, the rhythm of rainfall, the flight of insects. And around the time the outer tribes grew bolder, the signs began to change. The elders called it the Age of Whispers. It began with small things: torches that wouldn't stay lit, even when dry, birds falling silent at midday, unseasonal fog that clung to the ground and refused to rise, smoke that curled in the wrong direction, carrying with it sense of burning that had not yet begun. To most, it was superstition, but to the flame bearers, it was a prophecy in motion. The smoke dancers, guardians of atmospheric firecraft, reported strange behavior during rituals. Flames bent toward the east, defying wind. Ash rose and then hovered, forming temporary spirals midair before dissolving. Resin from sacred trees began to darken, turning thick and black, like blood left too long in the sun. Some among the heart circle said the jungle was changing, watching more closely. Others believed something had awakened. And then came the fire moths. For centuries, the flame bearers had coexisted with these rare, luminescent insects that only appeared during the triple dark moon, a rare celestial alignment. But during the Age of Whispers, they began appearing out of season, swarming certain parts of the jungle and dying en masse near the thorn walls. Their bodies, once glowing faintly orange, now shimmered dark red, a shade known among the flame bearers as kavra, or the color of violated fire. This was not mere ecology. This was an omen. The ash walkers, trained to read patterns in soot and flame, uncovered the same spiral symbols repeating across burned sites, but distorted, twisted, almost broken. It was as if the flame itself had begun to stutter. One particularly sacred fire pit, the voice circle, used for ceremonial births, spontaneously extinguished during a naming ceremony. The fire simply died. No wind, no rain. That child was later found asleep in the jungle, surrounded by a ring of thornless vines, untouched but changed. His eyes glowed faintly when he breathed. The coal mothers were the first to speak the forbidden thought. The fire is remembering something we forgot. They believed an ancient bond had been broken, a vow Askara once made to the jungle itself, a pact of balance, and that something, buried, sealed, or simply ignored, was beginning to surface. In dreams, children spoke of a burning sky, of trees that screamed, of rivers filled with coal. Elders who had never left the jungle began carving new glyphs into stone, symbols that had not been used in hundreds of years. One word kept appearing: you are Yuzan, the flame that devours itself. It was a name of terror, one that even the oldest oral histories avoided. According to scattered fragments, you are Yuzan was not a spirit, not a god, but a memory, a time, a thing that once consumed part of the jungle, long ago, and had to be buried alive beneath flame and thorn. And now it stirred. In response, the flame bearers initiated the second smoke vigil, a rite only performed once before, during the age of Iskara herself. Every torch in the jungle was extinguished. For 7 nights, no flame burned. Only silence. The idea was simple. If the fire listened, then silence might calm it. But on the 4th night, the stars vanished. Not behind clouds. They simply did not appear. The jungle turned unnaturally black, a darkness so thick it pressed against the skin. And from that darkness, some claimed to hear a deep, slow breathing, like the jungle inhaling something vast. A single tree burst into flame, without touch. It burned blue, not orange. The elders named the event the first shiver. The silence had not calmed the fire. It had angered it. And something, deep beneath Kortal, began to move. The jungle had always spoken in symbols. But now, it began to scream, not with sound, but with signs too large to ignore. Entire groves of sacred trees, fire-bearers that had survived for generations, began to rot from the inside out, collapsing without disease. Thorn walls that once twisted protectively around flame-bearer settlements turned inward, as if trying to trap those they once guarded. Insects swarmed in unnatural patterns, forming sigils across the jungle floor that matched no known glyphs in the Flame Codex. It was the second shiver, and with it came the fracture. For the first time in centuries, the unity of the Heart Circle broke. A faction rose from within the Ashwalkers and the Flintbinders, younger, radical voices who believed the old ways were failing. They called themselves the Thorn Keepers, and they carried a terrifying idea. We are not guardians of the flame. We are its prisoners. Led by a fire-born visionary named Soltek, the Thorn Keepers claimed that the eternal flame, the Pyrocle, was not a gift of the jungle, but a cage. They believed that the fire was not meant to be kept alive forever, but to be burned out, so the jungle could heal, so balance could return. They saw the signs not as warnings, but as pleas, the jungle begging to be released from its endless cycle of flame and memory. This was heresy. The flame bearers had no prisons. They did not believe in jails or exile. Instead, they summoned the Circle of Smoke, a rare and sacred trial where memory itself bore witness. Elders burned sacred resin in the temple of the living fire and inhaled its smoke, calling upon ancestral memory to judge Soltek's words. The verdict was not executed. It was worse. Forgetting. Soltek and his followers were declared unburned, their names struck from all flame records, their sigils erased, their songs forbidden. They were banished beyond the Thorn Line with 1 torch each, never to be spoken of again. But the jungle remembers what the flame bearers try to forget. Decades later, whispers began to circulate in the root tunnels and vine bridges. Campsites found abandoned, marked by spirals burned upside down. Thorn knots shredded, not cut. Fireflies blinking in strange, rhythmic patterns, not warnings, but messages. The Thorn Keepers had survived, and they had changed. They no longer marked themselves in coal, but in blood-soaked ash. They no longer worshipped the flame, but studied its decay, how it died, how it spread. They learned to ignite smoke without heat, to call insects in waves, to weaponize rot. They became the anti-fire, not enemies of the jungle, but agents of its rebalance. Some claimed they had learned to control the jungle itself, to direct its vines, its sickness, its silence, to make the trees weep on command, to make the flame scream. In one chilling account, a scouting party of Ember Tongues vanished during a routine patrol of the outer jungle. Days later, their torches were found planted upright in a circle, unlit, with a single coal burning at the center, an impossible symbol known as the Crown of Undoing. The flame bearers doubled the smoke vigils. They lit beacon fires atop the cliffs of Kurtal. They recarved the thorn walls with deeper blood ink. But the truth was clear. The jungle was no longer whispering. It was choosing sides. To understand the war that followed, one must understand the laws it broke. The flame bearers had no concept of conquest. They did not believe in expansion or dominion. Their world was made of circles, flame circles, elder circles, memory loops, and the idea of a straight path, of a march to claim or destroy, was alien to them. But the Thorn Keepers understood straight lines. They had walked in exile long enough to draw one through the jungle, a path of return. It began quietly, small fires in forbidden zones, burning with green flame, a signal that the old rules were being rewritten. Sacred thorn walls found curled open from the inside, as if the jungle itself had permitted entry. Silent apparitions seen in the smoke plumes at dawn, silhouettes of former flame-bearers, now unrecognizable in their cloaks of rot-colored bark and bone ash. The Heart Circle dismissed them at first. They believed the Thorn Keepers had gone mad or vanished. But Soltek had not disappeared. He had evolved. He no longer saw the flame-bearers as misguided kin. He saw them as a disease, kept alive by tradition and ritual, one that smothered the jungle in its obsession with memory and fire. So the Thorn Keepers came, not as an army, but as a slow plague. They poisoned the tree fires. Sacred bark would no longer burn. They bred a silent wasp whose sting dulled memory for weeks. They taught the roots to move, not fast, but deliberate, slowly shifting the jungle's shape until no map, no sigil, no star trail led true. And then came the unburning. Entire settlements were found extinguished, not attacked, not destroyed, but simply silenced. No flame, no songs, no ash, only symbols carved into the canopy above, a weeping eye with no pupil, the mark of the Thorn Keepers. The flame-bearers finally responded with fire, great sweeping walls of flame known as the Wreaths of Memory, meant to cleanse and seal. But the jungle, now confused by divided intent, rebelled. Some trees exploded into bloom instead of burning. Others twisted mid-combustion and grew into ash trees, black and hollow, yet pulsing with life. The flame was no longer fully obedient. The jungle had started thinking for itself. The war was not fought in open battle, but in rituals and disappearances, in the corruption of sacred groves and the twisting of meaning. Memory became a weapon. The Thorn Keepers began erasing entire events from communal recall, destroying flame codices and ash-carved histories. In desperation, the flame-bearers formed a secret order, the Coal Speakers. These were memory walkers who learned to whisper history into living fire, embedding tales into flame itself, bypassing parchment, even bypassing human memory. One night, a coal speaker named Ericon lit a torch with a personal story, the birth of her daughter, and the fire wept. The story lived. From that moment, flame-bearers began burning their most sacred truths into fire, hoping it would carry them through the fog of war. Entire chants were designed to be sung not to the tribe, but to fire itself, so that even if the people forgot, the flame would remember. But flame is fragile. Flame dies when starved. And the Thorn Keepers were patient. They did not need to win the war in a generation. They only needed to wait for the last fire to forget. By the 9th cycle of Ashfall, the jungle had grown quiet. Not in peace, but in tension. As if the vines themselves were listening. As if the roots were eavesdropping on footsteps. There were no more clear borders now. Every step forward might lead into a trap of memory, or into a lie stitched into the leaves by the Thornkeeper's song. The Coal Speakers moved in pairs now, one to speak and one to listen, because flame whispers had begun to lie. Some fires, once loyal to truth, had turned. Burned memories began returning twisted. A chant about birth would reappear as one of stillbirth. A story of a hero would replay as betrayal. Even the fire was losing its certainty. Desperation crept into the flame bearers. The Heart Circle convened for the first time without fire, a breach of sacred law. But they feared the flames had been infiltrated. Instead, they sat in silence, surrounded by cold ash, and listened to the jungle breathe. And it was there that a decision was made, a pilgrimage to the Ember Core. The Ember Core was not a place. It was a living fire, the first ever kindled by the ancestors. Hidden deep in the jungle's throat, surrounded by 3 concentric thorn labyrinths, guarded by beasts bred from both root and flame. It was said to be older than memory itself and immune to corruption. Only the Ember Core could decide whether the flame bearers were still worthy. Only it could be truly remembered. A group of 7 was chosen, not warriors, but speakers, singers, fire listeners, and 2 children, for it was believed that only those who still held innocence could pass through the thorn mazes uncut. What they encountered was not fire. It was a voice, raw, genderless, enormous. It did not speak in words, but in pulse. The jungle hummed with it. Their bones shivered with it. And when they emerged, 2 days later, they bore no flame. Only black soot across their foreheads, drawn in the spiral of unending time, a mark not of blessing, but of warning. The heart's circle understood. The Ember Core no longer saw them as pure fire-bearers. They had allowed division. They had allowed fear. They had forgotten their first oath, to carry memory without distortion. Now, the jungle would decide. And the jungle was angry. That very night, the first Thorns storms arrived. Violent, vine-wrapped tempests that shredded entire settlements, dragging screaming elders into the canopy, replacing trees with hollow bone spires that hummed with distorted chants. The flame-bearers had lost more than territory. They had lost the balance of listening and speaking. Now, even their own fire whispered doubts. Even the jungle, once their ally, became a trickster. And deep beneath the roots, the Thornkeepers smiled. By the 10th season of Vanishing Moons, the jungle no longer spoke in prophecy or parable. It screamed. The flame-bearer's fire, once a gentle teacher, had become volatile. Torches flared unpredictably. Campfires burst into violent shapes without wind. Memory chants burned holes in the mouths of those who sang them wrong. The jungle had shifted from balance to judgment. Entire groves would awaken in the night, their roots dragging sleeping children from their nests, returning them days later, changed. These returned children bore marks over their eyes, could no longer speak the tongue of fire, and dreamed only in vines and bones. They were called the Unremembered, and they began to outnumber the elders. Soltek's vision was working. The Thornkeepers didn't seek total annihilation. They sought replacement. A new order of jungle dwellers who lived not by memory, but by instinct. Not by spoken tradition, but by root-deep hunger. No rituals, no circles, no old names. Only survival, submission, and silence. But there were those among the flame-bearers who would not bow. From the remaining tribes, a last circle was formed, not of elders, but of broken flames. These were those who had lost everything. Children, fire codes, entire family lines. They had nothing left to protect, and so nothing left to fear. They called themselves the Ashbound. The Ashbound returned to the oldest law, one that predated even the Ember Core, a law forbidden since the dawn of the first spiral, to summon the fire that devours. Unlike the gentle memory fire, the devouring flame did not listen. It did not chant. It was erased. The ritual to summon it was a blood rite. It required silence, severance, and the burning of one's name. The Ashbound performed it deep beneath the ruined circle of fire sky. For 3 days, they fasted. For 3 nights, they bled. And on the final breath, they lit a single match carved from the bark of the oldest listening tree, and the jungle trembled. The sky darkened. Animals fled. And where once there were trees, now stood a swirling wall of living flame. Black at the center, orange at the tips, and whispering nothing. The fire that devours had no memory. And at that moment, neither did Ashbound. They marched without songs. They struck without names. Every Thornkeeper camp they found was reduced to scorched earth, but not with hatred, with absolute forgetting. Even Soltek, deep in his citadel of thorns, began to feel dread. Not because he feared death, but because he feared being erased from the story. This was no longer a war of fire against vine. It was a war of memory against oblivion. The jungle, caught between 2 extremes, began to unravel. Birds sang forgotten languages. Trees turned to ash mid-blossom. Old spirits, once banished, returned, confused, blind, and furious. No one controlled the war anymore. It had become a living entity, and it demanded a final reckoning. And so it came to this: ash falling like snow, flames without songs, vines without roots, a jungle without breath. The final war was not marked by a trumpet or the sound of horns, but by silence. An unnatural stillness that spread across the canopies, through the ravines, and over the ruins, a hush before the end. The ashbound advanced with eyes like cooled coals. They didn't look at what burned behind them, only forward, toward the last surviving spiral stronghold of the Thorn Keepers. It was not built from stone or wood, but from bone, twisted and stacked into a tower that reached toward the storm-sick sky. Around it coiled vines as thick as rivers, pulsing with sickly green light. The air was heavy with forgotten dreams, remnants of memories the Thorn Keepers had devoured and reshaped. At the top of that tower waited Soltek, no longer fully human, if he ever had been. His face had faded, replaced by a mask of thorns. His voice, once velvet and deep, now crackled with the rustling of dry leaves. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He was the jungle's disease made flesh. But the jungle no longer stood with him. It had grown tired. The final confrontation was not a battle, not in the way stories often paint them. There were no armies clashing under banners, no champions dueling in noble honor. There was only destruction, systemic, relentless, an unmaking of all that had been built. The ashbound lit a ring of devouring flame around the bone tower. The fire hissed, not because it was alive, but because it hungered. Thorn beasts shrieked as they tried to flee, vines withered mid-curl, and the tower itself began to moan, not from wind, but from the voices trapped within it, now being unspooled into ash. Soltek did not scream. He stepped into the flame, and vanished, not burned, not destroyed, but forgotten, as if he had never existed. The flame did not celebrate. It simply moved on. And when the fire died, what was left was silence, pure, deafening, unnatural silence. No chants, no songs, no names, only soot and wind. The ashbound dropped to their knees, not in triumph, but in mourning. They had won, but at what cost? There were no flame bearers left, no thorn keepers, only stories, half remembered by the earth and whispered by winds that no longer carried meaning. It would take generations for the jungle to breathe again, to dream, to remember. And even then, the fire that returned would be different, quieter, less certain. The spiral of memory has been broken and reborn. Years passed, then decades, and the jungle began to forget. From the blackened earth, green returned, hesitant, pale, but determined. Rain fell again, not in rage, but in rhythm, as if the sky had decided to sing once more. Where once stood towers of bone, now stood nothing, just clearings. And in those clearings, something stirred: children, not of the ashbound, not of the thorn keepers, not even of the flame bearers, for none had survived. These children were born of silence, raised by wind and water, taught not by chance, but by instinct and patience. They carried no sigils, wore no war paint, but they listened, and in their eyes flickered a new kind of fire, not of destruction nor memory, but of curiosity. The jungle had chosen again. It did not resurrect the past. I rewrote it. Small stone spirals began to appear again, not as ancient altars, but as playful patterns drawn in the dirt by children. They didn't know why they drew them, only that it felt right. One day, beneath the shadow of a fallen tree, a young girl placed a red berry into the center of her spiral. Her younger brother laughed and did the same. A bird watched. A root twitched. Somewhere deep underground, a memory stirred, not fully formed, not yet awake, but waiting. They had no names for themselves yet, but one day they would. And maybe, just maybe, they would call themselves flame bearers again, or maybe something new entirely. Because this was not a return to the past. This was a beginning. The jungle, the true jungle, not of vines or fire, but of story, had once more found its way. And in the silence after the fire, it whispered, "You do not need names to matter. You only need to remember the cost and choose differently." The wind carried that whisper through the canopy, over rivers, and into the hearts of the new children. They didn't understand the words. Not yet, but they would. Someday, when the jungle was ready. And when they were. Years passed, then decades, and the jungle began to forget. From the blackened earth, green returned, hesitant, pale, but determined. Rain fell again, not in rage, but in rhythm, as if the sky had decided to sing once more. Where once stood towers of bone, now stood nothing, just clearings. And in those clearings, something stirred, children, not of the ashbound, not of the thorn keepers, not even of the flame bearers, for none had survived. These children were born of silence, raised by wind and water, taught not by chance, but by instinct and patience. They carried no sigils, wore no war paint, but they listened, and in their eyes flickered a new kind of fire, not of destruction nor memory, but of curiosity. The jungle had chosen again. It did not resurrect the past. I rewrote it. Small stone spirals began to appear again, not as ancient altars, but as playful patterns drawn in the dirt by children. They didn't know why they drew them, only that it felt right. One day, beneath the shadow of a fallen tree, a young girl placed a red berry into the center of her spiral. Her younger brother laughed and did the same. A bird watched. A root twitched. Somewhere deep underground, a memory stirred, not fully formed, not yet awake, but waiting. They had no names for themselves yet, but one day they would. And maybe, just maybe, they would call themselves flame bearers again, or maybe something new entirely. Because this was not a return to the past. This was a beginning. The jungle, the true jungle, not of vines or fire, but of story, had once more found its way. And in the silence after the fire, it whispered, "You do not need names to matter. You only need to remember the cost and choose differently." The wind carried that whisper through the canopy, over rivers, and into the hearts of the new children. They didn't understand the words. Not yet, but they would. Someday, when the jungle was ready. And when they were.